The toast was a quiet cruelty, delivered with the sweet smile Lady Honora Bellamy reserved for her most public acts of malice. She raised her glass, the crystal catching the candlelight of the ballroom, her eyes finding her niece across the room. "And to my dearest Phoebe," she said, her voice carrying just enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "So fortunate to have a place with us. A reminder that charity, like family, begins at home." A ripple of polite, pitying laughter went through the small assembly. Phoebe Ingram, standing near the wall where the chaperones congregated, did not flinch. She did not blush. She merely inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgment so devoid of emotion it seemed to swallow the insult whole. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were a currency her aunt refused to honor. Instead, she smoothed the worn fabric of her gray silk gown, a hand-me-down from her cousin Louisa, altered with her own precise stitches, and took a small, deliberate sip of her lemonade. She was 24 years old, and for the 6 years since her parents' passing, she had been Lady Bellamy's ward. A ward, her aunt often reminded the Society of Marley, with no fortune to speak of. A plain, quiet girl who was lucky to have a roof over her head at Bramblehurst Park. What Lady Bellamy failed to mention was that the roof over all their heads was kept in repair by Phoebe's meticulous management. It was Phoebe who stretched the dwindling household budget, who renegotiated terms with the butcher and the baker, who spent her nights poring over ledgers that bled red ink, finding pennies to save where her aunt saw only pounds to spend. Bramblehurst Park was a house of genteel decay. The grandeur was a facade, propped up by debt and Phoebe's invisible labor. Lady Bellamy, a woman for whom appearances were a religion, insisted on maintaining a certain lifestyle. This meant new gowns for her daughter Louisa, a passable carriage, and evenings like this one, all funded by a mysterious wellspring of credit that Phoebe knew was running dry. The money, Phoebe had long suspected, was not credit at all. It was capital. Her capital. Her father had been a careful man, a barrister who had married for love into a family with old, if obscure, land. He would not have left her destitute. But the will was sealed, in her aunt's keeping, and any inquiry was met with a sigh and a lecture on the sin of ingratitude. "Oh, poor Phoebe," her cousin Louisa murmured, drifting over to her side, her pink satin gown rustling like a field of flowers. "Mama can be so dreadful. Don't mind her." Louisa's sympathy was as shallow as a saucer of milk, but it was not unkind. She was a product of her mother's teachings, pretty, polished, and profoundly unaware of the mechanics of the world. She believed, as she had been told, that Phoebe was simply the poor relation, an object of their family's noble charity. "I don't mind her," Phoebe said, her voice even. And it was the truth. Minding her aunt was a luxury she could not afford. It took energy, and energy was a resource she needed for other things. For ensuring the cook had enough flour for the week, for mending the fine lace on Louisa's cuffs so her mother wouldn't have to buy new, for keeping the whole precarious structure of their lives from collapsing. Her gaze drifted across the room, past the dancing couples, and landed on him. Gideon Rothwell, the Duke of Severn. He was a new and formidable fixture in their small county, having recently inherited the title and the vast, cold estate of Kestrel Chase. He was a man forged in shadow and silence. A widower, they whispered, though his wife had died years ago. A soldier, they said, who had seen too much in the wars on the continent. He stood alone, a pillar of black broadcloth against the gilded wallpaper, his face a mask of stern indifference. He rarely spoke, never smiled, and his presence seemed to lower the temperature of any room he entered. The mothers of the county were terrified of him, yet they pushed their daughters in his direction like lambs to a quiet, handsome slaughter. He ignored them all. Phoebe's attention was not on the Duke himself, but on the small, intricate detail of his waistcoat. The brocade was of a French design, complex and beautiful. She found her fingers twitching, a familiar habit, itching to trace the pattern, to understand its construction. It was a mind for detail, for systems and patterns that allowed her to make sense of the tangled mess of her aunt's finances. It was the same impulse that drew her to the delicate, almost impossible task she kept in her sewing box. It was a handkerchief, fine cambric, edged in Brussels lace, yellowed with age. Her mother's. During the chaotic week after her parents' funeral, a lit candle had fallen onto it, burning a jagged hole in the centre. Lady Bellamy had declared it ruined, fit only for the bin. Phoebe had rescued it. For 6 years, in stolen moments of quiet, she had been repairing it. Not by patching it, but by reweaving it, thread by thread, using a magnifying glass and silk filaments so fine they were nearly invisible. It was a foolish, sentimental task, but it was hers. It was an act of creation in a life of thankless preservation. The hole was nearly gone now, the pattern of the original fabric seamlessly, painstakingly restored. It was a secret victory, a testament to the fact that what one person declared ruined, another could, with patience and skill, make whole again. The music swelled, and Louisa was swept away by a young officer. Phoebe remained by the wall, a ghost in grey silk. She was not bitter. Bitterness, like tears, was an indulgence. She was simply waiting. She did not know what for. A change, a reckoning. A moment when the sums would finally be called to account. She watched the Duke of Severn turn his head, his cool, assessing gaze sweeping the room. For a fraction of a second, his eyes met hers. There was no warmth in them, no interest. It was the look of a man cataloguing the furniture. Then he looked away. Phoebe lowered her own gaze to her hands, resting in her lap. They were steady. They were always steady. It was the only thing in her life she could entirely control. The assembly at the Marley Town Hall, a fortnight later, was a less formal affair, but the county's social calculus remained as rigid as ever. Lady Bellamy held court near the refreshment table, Louisa fluttered among a flock of similarly adorned young ladies, and Phoebe found a quiet corner near a set of open French doors, letting the cool night air wash over her. It was here that Mr. Farrow, a tenant farmer from an adjacent property, found her. He was a man with worry etched into the lines of his face, his hands thick with work. "Miss Ingram," he began, twisting his hat. "Forgive me for bothering you." "Not at all, Mr. Farrow. Is all well?" She knew he had been struggling with a field of barley that had failed for 2 seasons running. She had overheard her aunt dismissing his troubles as poor management. "It's the north field, miss. The soil is soured. Lady Bellamy's steward says to let it lie fallow, but that's another year with no yield. I was thinking of trying turnips. They say it cleans the ground, but it's a risk." Phoebe nodded, her mind clicking through the agricultural pamphlets she read in the late hours of the night. Not for pleasure, but because the estate's productivity was inextricably linked to her own survival. "Turnips would help fix the nitrogen, certainly," she said, her voice low and direct. "But have you considered a rotation of clover first? It's less taxing on the soil,
and provides excellent fodder. If you sow it in early spring, you could still get a late crop of rye in the autumn. It would mean a smaller, immediate return, but a healthier field in the long run.
The soil at Bramblehurst is heavy clay. It needs careful management. Mr. Farrow stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had expected a polite nod, perhaps a vague murmur of sympathy. He had not expected a detailed, practical strategy. "Clover," he repeated, the word tasting new and hopeful. "Aye, I'd not thought of that. Thank you, miss, truly." He backed away with a bow, his expression one of dawning respect. Phoebe watched him go, a faint, rare warmth spreading through her chest. It was the satisfaction of a problem solved, a system righted. She turned back to the cool air, not noticing the silent figure who had been standing in the shadows of the doorway, just out of sight. Gideon Rothwell, Duke of Severn, had come to the assembly out of a grim sense of duty. He found such gatherings tedious, a parade of artifice and ambition. He had been about to leave when the low, serious conversation caught his ear. He had stopped, not to eavesdrop, but because the content was so unexpected. He had assumed it was two farmers talking. Then he saw the girl in the plain grey dress, her profile clear against the dark garden. He recognized her from the ball, the poor relation, the one with the unnervingly still face. He had spent the last decade of his life dealing with matters of substance, logistics, strategy, the grim mathematics of war. He valued evidence, competence, and plain speaking. He had no patience for social maneuvering. What he had just heard was competence. Pure, unadorned competence on a topic no young lady of her station should know or care about. It was delivered without flourish, as a simple statement of fact. He found himself observing her. She was not pretty in the way her cousin was. Her features were too serious, her expression too contained. But there was a harmony to her, a lack of extraneous motion. While other women fluttered and gestured, she was a point of stillness. Her hands were in her lap, and he noticed she was working on something small and white, a handkerchief. From his position, he could not see the detail, only the intense, focused precision of her movements, the needle rising and falling with an economy that was almost hypnotic. It was the second time she had registered on his notice. The first time, at the ball, he had seen her composure under her aunt's public barb. It was not the meekness of a victim, but the self-possession of someone who had weathered far worse in private. Now this, an unexpected depth of practical knowledge. It was like finding a geode in a field of chalk, a plain exterior hiding a complex, crystalline structure within. He had a problem, a significant problem named Sorrel Down, a secondary estate in his portfolio that was hemorrhaging money. Its records were a disaster, its steward elderly and incompetent. His own man at Kestrel Chase was already overburdened. He needed someone with a mind for detail, for systems. Someone who could look at a column of figures and see the story beneath. He needed a mind like the one that had just prescribed a crop rotation of clover and rye. An idea began to form, unconventional and starkly practical. It was an arrangement that would be seen as bizarre, even scandalous. But Gideon Rothwell had long ago stopped caring about the opinions of the county. He cared about results. He watched the girl for another moment as she carefully folded the small white cloth and placed it in a reticule, her movements deliberate and final. He saw no vanity in her, no pleading for attention. He saw only a quiet, formidable capability. It was a quality he understood. It was a quality he respected far more than beauty or charm. He made a decision. It was a decision that would unravel one life,
and utterly remake another. Without another word to anyone, he turned and left the assembly hall, his purpose for the evening suddenly, unexpectedly clear.
2 days later, the Duke of Severn's carriage, a severe black coach emblazoned with a silver kestrel, rolled up the gravel drive of Bramblehurst Park. Its arrival caused a panic. Louisa shrieked with excitement, convinced the Duke had finally come to call on her. Lady Bellamy, flustered but triumphant, ordered the best tea service to be brought out, one they could ill afford to use. Phoebe was in the small back office, the one her father had used, transferring the final entry from the weekly accounts into the main ledger. The ink was a cheap, watery brown, but her figures were immaculate. She heard the commotion but did not move. The Duke's visits were not for her. A maid, her face flushed, appeared at the door. "Miss Ingram, Lady Bellamy requires your presence in the drawing room." Phoebe felt a flicker of surprise. She was usually hidden away when important guests called. "Thank you, Effie. I will be there presently." She carefully blotted the page, closed the ledger, and locked it in the desk drawer. The key went onto the simple iron ring she wore on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her bodice. It was a habit of caution she had developed over years of living with her aunt. When she entered the drawing room, the scene was tense. The Duke stood by the fireplace, refusing all offers of tea or seating. He dominated the room, his stillness more powerful than any gesture. Lady Bellamy was perched on the edge of a settee, her smile stretched thin. Louisa was trying to look engaged and charming, but was clearly intimidated by their visitor's silence. "Ah, Phoebe, dear," Lady Bellamy said, her tone falsely bright. "His Grace was just asking after you." Phoebe looked at the Duke. His gaze was direct and unreadable. "Your Grace?" she said, giving a small curtsy. He gave a curt nod in return. He did not waste time on pleasantries. "Miss Ingram," he began, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the light in the room. "I have a business proposition for your aunt." He turned his gaze to Lady Bellamy, who blinked in confusion. "A business proposition," she repeated. "I am in need of a particular service," the Duke continued, his words clipped and precise. "I have an estate, Sorrel Down, whose accounts are in a state of chaos. My own man is occupied. I require someone with a keen eye for figures and a methodical mind to put them in order. I have been led to believe that your household is managed with remarkable efficiency, despite circumstances." The veiled reference to her financial state was a clear, sharp jab. Lady Bellamy's face tightened. We manage, Your Grace." "Indeed," the Duke said, a single word that carried the weight of a full audit. "I have heard that Miss Ingram is instrumental in that management. I propose to employ her. She will reside at Sorrel Down for a period of 3 months. She will have full access to the estate's books and household staff. Her task is to create a clear, accurate, and functional system of accounting." The room fell into a stunned silence. Louisa stared, aghast at the idea of her cousin being offered a job. It was scandalous. It was degrading. Lady Bellamy found her voice first. "Your Grace, that is impossible. Phoebe is a gentlewoman. She cannot be employed as a clerk." "I am not offering her a position as a clerk," the Duke stated flatly. "I am offering her stewardship of a project. She will be treated with the respect due to her station. She will have her own rooms, and the housekeeper will answer to her. In return for her services, and for the inconvenience to your household," he added, his eyes glinting with something that might have been irony, I am prepared to settle your outstanding accounts with the merchants in Mali. In full. That was the masterstroke. Lady Bellamy's carefully constructed composure shattered. The debts were a constant, terrifying pressure. The threat of public humiliation was her greatest fear. The Duke was offering her a lifeline, but the price was her pride, and the public acknowledgement of a truth she had long concealed, that Phoebe was not a burden, but the pillar holding her world aloft. Phoebe stood motionless, her mind racing. An escape. It was a gilded cage, perhaps, but it was a different cage from the one she was in. To be away from her aunt's daily cruelties, to have a task that was clear and defined, to be valued not for her bloodline or her looks, but for her mind. It was a proposition of breathtaking novelty. Sorrel Down. The name sounded quiet, peaceful. The decision, of course, rests with you, Lady Bellamy, the Duke said, and with Miss Ingram. He turned his gaze to Phoebe, and for the first time she felt he was truly speaking to her, not as a piece in a transaction, but as a participant. I require honesty and diligence, nothing more. Will you do it? It was not a plea, it was a challenge, a plain-spoken question that demanded a plain-spoken answer. Lady Bellamy was already calculating. The debts would be gone. Phoebe would be out of the house, leaving Louisa the sole focus of her matrimonial ambitions. She could spin the story as a great favor to the Duke, a mark of their family's close ties to him. "Well," she began, affecting a grand reluctance, "if His Grace is in such need, and it would be of true service." Phoebe did not wait for her aunt to finish. She looked directly at the Duke of Severn. "Yes," she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a gavel. "I will do it." The Duke gave another of his curt nods. There was no smile, no warmth, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. It was acknowledgement. "Very well," he said. "My carriage will collect you in 3 days' time. Be ready." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a shattered social order and the first faint glint of a dawning future. Sorrel Down was a house that had been holding its breath. It was a handsome old manor of gray stone, nestled in a shallow valley, but a film of neglect lay over everything. The gardens were overgrown with weeds, the windows were grimy, and the air inside was cold and smelled of dust and disuse. Phoebe's arrival was met by a single servant, the housekeeper, a woman with a face like a weathered crabapple and a fiercely starched apron. "I am Mrs. Draycott," she announced, her voice as crisp as her uniform. "His Grace has instructed me that you are to be given the run of the place. The master's study is prepared for your work." The pause was slight, but Phoebe heard the disapproval in it. A young lady, playing at being a steward. It was an absurdity. "Thank you, Mrs. Draycott," Phoebe replied calmly, untying the ribbons of her bonnet. "I will require the estate ledgers for the past 5 years, all household account books, and any correspondence from tenants regarding rents or repairs." The housekeeper's eyebrows shot up. She had expected a flighty girl who would rearrange the furniture. She had not expected a commander issuing clear, precise orders. "They are in the study," she said, her tone grudgingly respectful. "As you will find, they are in a considerable state of disarray." "That is why I am here," Phoebe said simply. The days that followed fell into a quiet, methodical rhythm. Phoebe rose with the dawn, took a simple breakfast of tea and toast in her room, and then descended to the study. It was a dark, wood-paneled room, and the ledgers were, As Mrs. Draycott had warned, a catastrophe. Entries were missing, figures were scratched out, and pages were stained with what looked like port. For 2 days, Phoebe did nothing but read. She absorbed the chaos, letting the patterns of neglect and mismanagement form in her mind. She saw where the old steward had been forgetful, where he had been lazy, and where, she suspected, he had been quietly dishonest. On the 3rd day, she began her work. She did not try to correct the old books. Instead, she started a new set of ledgers, her handwriting a model of clarity. She created a system, cross-referencing tenants' payments with maintenance requests, household expenditures with suppliers' invoices. It was a slow, painstaking process, like her repair of the handkerchief, but it brought her a deep, quiet satisfaction. She was not just recording numbers. She was imposing order on chaos. She was making something broken functional again. Mrs. Draycott watched her from a distance. She saw the light in the study burning late into the night. She saw the girl emerge only for simple meals, her fingers sometimes smudged with ink. She saw that Miss Ingram asked for nothing for herself, but made detailed inquiries about the state of the roof, the quality of the seed grain, and the health of the tenants' children. The housekeeper's suspicion began to slowly, grudgingly, morph into respect. One evening, she entered the study to find Phoebe asleep at the desk, her head pillowed on a ledger, a pen still held loosely in her hand. A thick shawl had fallen to the floor. Silently, Mrs. Draycott picked it up and draped it over the girl's shoulders. It was the first gesture of kindness Phoebe had received in the house. When she was not working on the books, Phoebe explored the grounds. She was drawn to a large, walled garden behind the main house. It had once been beautiful, but was now a tangled wilderness of thorns and weeds. In one corner, however, a single, stubborn rosebush was still producing deep crimson flowers. She found a pair of old shears in a potting shed and began to clear the weeds around it. The work was hard. Her hands were not used to it, and she pricked her fingers on the thorns. But like the ledgers, it was a problem she could solve. Bit by bit, she cleared a small patch, turning over the soil, giving the old rose breathing room. The Duke began to visit. His arrivals were always unannounced. He would simply appear in the doorway of the study, silent and observant. He never stayed long. He would look at the new set of ledgers, the neat columns of figures, the growing stack of organized files. He would ask a few direct questions. What is the discrepancy in the timber sales from last year? Why has the rent from Miller's farm been in arrears for 18 months? Phoebe would answer him plainly, without excuse or embellishment. The timber was sold, but the payment was never recorded. I have written to the buyer to request a copy of his receipt. The Miller family has had sickness for 2 years. The old steward did not inform you. I propose we forgive half the debt and arrange a schedule for the rest, contingent on the son taking over the work. Gideon would listen, his expression unchanging. He would nod. Proceed. One afternoon, he found her in the walled garden, her face smudged with dirt, her hands braced on her knees as she looked at the cleared patch around the rosebush. He stood at the gate for a long time, watching her. She had not noticed him. There was a look of fierce concentration on her face, a look of profound satisfaction. He thought of his own home, Kestrel Chase. It was grand. It was perfectly managed, but it was silent and cold. It was a house without a heart, a place he occupied, but did not inhabit. He looked at this quiet, serious woman, bringing order to a set of books, and life to a forgotten garden, and felt a stir of something he had not felt in years. It was not admiration, precisely. It was recognition. The next time he came, he did not go to the study. He went to the garden. He found her on her knees, pulling weeds. He did not say a word, but handed her a small, leather-bound book. She took it, her dirt-stained fingers leaving a smudge on the cover. The title was embossed in gold. On the Cultivation of Old Roses. She looked up at him, her gray eyes wide with surprise.
"Thank you, Your Grace."
"The soil here is acidic," he said, his first words to her that were not about business. "You will need to add lime." He turned and walked away before she could reply. Phoebe watched him go, clutching the book to her chest. It was the heaviest, most precious thing she had ever held. The news that the Duke of Severn had installed Lady Bellamy's poor relation as a glorified bookkeeper at Sorrel Down spread through the county like wildfire. It was a delicious scandal, and no one savored it more than Miss Arabella Vaughan. Arabella was the county's reigning beauty, possessed of a fortune, a flawless sense of style, and a will of iron. She had long considered the Duke of Severn her own personal project, a magnificent, untamed prize to be won. The sudden elevation of Phoebe Ingram from a non-entity to the object of the Duke's peculiar attention was an intolerable affront. She decided to inspect the situation for herself. Announcing a charitable visit to the tenants of Sorrel Down, she arrived in a carriage far too grand for the estate's muddy lanes, a basket of useless, expensive jellies on the seat beside her. She found Phoebe in the study, surrounded by papers. "My dear Phoebe," Arabella cooed, gliding into the room and bringing with her an overpowering scent of Parisian perfume. "How industrious you look! I confess, I could not imagine it. Tucked away here with all these dusty old books, it seems so bleak." "I find it satisfying, Miss Vaughan," Phoebe replied, not rising from her chair. She gestured to a pile of neatly stacked ledgers. "There is a great deal of satisfaction in creating order." "Order?" Arabella gave a light, tinkling laugh. "How droll! I should have thought a young woman would prefer society, dancing, life, but perhaps this suits you." Her eyes swept the room, taking in the plain furniture, the ink stains on Phoebe's fingers, the simple, unadorned dress she wore. The assessment was clear. This was Phoebe's proper place, among the dust and the details, far from the world of consequence. Arabella's visit was short, but her observations were sharp. She saw the way Mrs. Draycott now deferred to Phoebe. She saw the new ledgers, a testament to an unnerving level of competence. And when she took a stroll through the grounds, she saw the walled garden, where a significant section had been cleared and new shoots were beginning to appear. Most damning of all, she saw the book on roses lying open on a stone bench, its fine leather binding a clear mark of a wealthy giver. She knew, with a sickening certainty, who had given it. This was not a temporary whim. The Duke was genuinely interested in this drab little mouse. The girl's competence, her very lack of social grace, seemed to appeal to his strange, cold nature. Arabella realized that simple condescension would not be enough to dislodge her. A more direct attack was needed. She drove straight from Sorrel Down to Bramblehurst Park. She found Lady Bellamy in a state of high anxiety. The Duke had paid her debts as promised, but the relief was tempered by the humiliation. Her friends were barely concealing their amusement, and Louisa's season was being overshadowed by the gossip about her peculiar cousin.
"Honora, we have a problem," Arabella said, dispensing with pleasantries. "Your niece is not merely organizing books, she is ingratiating herself with the Duke. He respects her." She said the word respects as if it were a contagion. "What can I do?" Lady Bellamy lamented. "He holds all the cards. I cannot simply demand he send her back." "No," Arabella said, her eyes narrowing. "You cannot. But we can make him want to send her back. We can show him what she truly is." "And what is that? A penniless, diligent boor?" "No, a thief." The word hung in the air. Lady Bellamy stared at her. "A thief? Phoebe? She is infuriatingly honest." "Then we shall have to provide the evidence of her dishonesty," Arabella said smoothly.
The Duke values evidence above all else. His trust in her is based on her competence with his finances. If that competence can be shown to be a cover for embezzlement, he will discard her without a second thought. He despises deceit. The plan she laid out was simple and vicious. Lady Bellamy, who still had a key to the house at Sorrel Down from a time when she had considered it a potential home for herself, would gain access to the study one night. Arabella, a skilled artist in her youth, had been practicing. She could mimic handwriting with uncanny accuracy. They would create a false page for the household ledger, detailing a series of fictitious payments made to a dressmaker in a nearby town, payments that would appear to be for Phoebe herself. They would use a different ink, one that could be sourced locally, and carefully age the page to match the others. "But she will deny it," Lady Bellamy protested, a flicker of fear in her eyes. It was one thing to be cruel, it was another to engage in criminal forgery. "Of course she will deny it," Arabella said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "But it will be her word against the written evidence in the ledger. Who is he more likely to believe? A girl he has known for a few months, or the clear proof of his own eyes? We will arrange for the discovery to be made by a third party, someone reputable who can express his concern to the Duke. It will be her ruin. He will send her back to you in disgrace, and the county will talk of nothing else. He will be so disgusted by his misjudgment that he will turn to someone he can trust, someone of his own class. Someone like her." Lady Bellamy hesitated. The risk was enormous, but so was the prize. To see Phoebe humbled, to have her own social standing restored, to clear the path for Louisa to marry a duke. Greed and resentment won out over fear. "When?" she whispered. "The Duke's annual tenants' ball is in 3 weeks' time at Kestrel Chase," Arabella said, her smile cold and sharp as ice. "We will act the week before. The scandal will break just in time to ensure she is not only dismissed, but utterly humiliated before the entire county." The forged page was a masterpiece of malice. Arabella's skill was undeniable. She had captured the slant and pressure of Phoebe's neat script almost perfectly. Lady Bellamy, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, slipped into Sorrel Down on a moonless night, the house silent and asleep. She found the household ledger on the desk, unlocked as Phoebe, growing confident in her solitude, now left it. With trembling hands, she unstitched the binding, inserted the false page detailing £300 in payments to a fictional modiste, and carefully stitched it back together. The entire operation took less than 10 minutes. She was back in her carriage before the stable clock struck midnight. A week later, just as Arabella had planned, a local squire named Mr. Corbett, a man deep in debt to Arabella's father, paid a visit to Kestrel Chase. He expressed his grave concern to the Duke. He had been visiting Sorrel Down, he claimed, and had chanced to see the household ledger left open. An entry had caught his eye, one that seemed irregular. Gideon received the news in his library, a vast, cold room where the books outnumbered the signs of life. He listened to Mr. Corbett's feigned reluctance without expression, his face an unreadable mask of stone. When the squire had finished, Gideon simply said, "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I will look into it." He dismissed the man, who scurried away, relieved to have done his part. For a long time after Corbett left, Gideon did not move. £300. It was a significant sum, but not a ruinous one. It was the nature of the alleged crime that struck him. A quiet, systematic theft disguised as legitimate expenses. A betrayal of the very trust he had placed in her competence. He felt a cold, familiar numbness creep into his chest. The same feeling that had followed him home from the battlefields. The same feeling that had settled in his heart after his first wife's long illness. It was the grim confirmation that all things, eventually, decay or betray. But then, another thought intruded. Phoebe. He pictured her in the dusty study, her brow furrowed in concentration. He pictured her in the neglected garden, her hands covered in dirt, a look of fierce satisfaction on her face. He recalled her plain-spoken answers, the way she presented facts without excuse or apology. Deceit did not fit the pattern. It was an anomaly, an entry that did not belong in the ledger of her character as he had come to read it. He ordered his horse and rode to Sorreldown himself. He did not send a messenger. This was a matter to be handled directly. He found her, as he expected, in the study. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She looked up as he entered, and a small, rare smile touched her lips, before vanishing as she saw the gravity of his expression. "Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet. "Is something amiss?" He walked to the desk and placed his gloved hands upon it. He did not issue an accusation. He made a request. "Miss Ingram, show me the household ledger." Her eyes did not waver. She simply reached for the heavy book and opened it for him. He turned the pages, his gaze scanning the columns. He found the page Mr. Corbett had mentioned. The entries were there, just as described. Payments to a Madame Giselle of Ewminster for gowns and fabrics. The handwriting was a near-perfect match. The ink was slightly different, but only if you were looking for it. It was a clever, damning piece of work. He looked up from the book and met her eyes. His own were cold as a winter sea. This was the moment of crisis, the fulcrum on which everything would turn. He asked the question, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "Explain this entry." Phoebe looked at the page. She saw the unfamiliar name, the impossible sums. The blood drained from her face, leaving it pale as parchment. She understood instantly what had happened. This was a deliberate, calculated that. She felt a surge of cold fury, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady. She had learned long ago not to plead. She would present evidence. "That is not my handwriting," she said plainly. "It is a remarkable facsimile," Gideon countered, his voice still flat. "The slant is too uniform," she replied, her mind locking onto the details, the system. "My S is slightly different when it follows a T. And the ink. It is not the same batch I have been using. Mine is from London. This is a cheaper grade, I believe. It bleeds slightly into the paper." She pointed a steady finger at a minuscule feathering on the edge of a number. It was a defense he had not expected. He had expected tears, denials, protestations of innocence. He had not expected a calm, forensic analysis of the forgery itself. "Can you prove it?" he asked. Yes, she said. She walked to the small desk in the corner of the room, the one she used for her own affairs. She unlocked a drawer and took out a small, plain notebook. I keep a private log, she explained, her voice even. A record of my work, my hours, and any significant expenses I authorize. I began the habit at Bramblehurst. It is for my own reference. She opened the notebook on the desk next to the ledger. Her private log was a mirror of her public work, meticulous, dated, detailed. For the dates in question, her log showed entries for seed grain, a new pump for the well, and payment to a traveling tinker for mending the kitchen's copper pots. There was no mention of a Madame Giselle, no mention of gowns or fabrics. The two books told two different stories. One was a public document, now compromised. The other was a private record of her integrity. Gideon looked from the forged page to the small, honest notebook. He looked at her face, pale but resolute, her gray eyes clear and direct. He had built his life on the assessment of evidence, both on the battlefield and off. And the evidence before him was not just in the ink and the handwriting. It was in the character of the woman who stood before him. A woman who met a charge of theft not with hysterics, but with a more accurate set of books. The cold numbness in his chest began to recede, replaced by a slow burning anger, not at her, but for her. He had been right. Deceit did not fit the pattern. He had been sent a piece of tainted evidence, part of a larger, uglier strategy. He closed the ledger. I see, he said. The two words were quiet, but they resonated with finality. He had seen the forgery. He had seen the truth. And he had seen the depth of the conspiracy against her. He looked at Phoebe, and for the first time allowed a measure of his own feeling to show in his eyes. They underestimated you, he said. And they underestimated me. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The Tenants' Ball at Kestrel Chase was the social pinnacle of the year. The great house, usually so silent and imposing, was thrown open, its rooms ablaze with 1,000 candles. The long gallery, with its polished oak floors and portraits of grim-faced ancestors, was filled with the sound of music and the rustle of silk. The entire county was in attendance, from the highest gentry to the most prosperous farmers, all eager to see and be seen by their formidable duke. Phoebe arrived on the duke's arm. This, in itself, was a shocking statement. She was not relegated to the position of a humble employee. She was escorted by her employer as if she were an honored guest. She wore a gown of deep blue velvet, a color that turned her quiet gray eyes to slate. It was not a new dress, it was another of Louisa's hand-me-downs, but she had recut it herself, the simple, elegant lines suiting her far better than any flounce or frill. On her bodice, she had pinned a single, perfect crimson rose from the garden at Sorrel Down. As they entered, a wave of whispers followed them. Lady Bellamy and Arabella Vaughan stood near the entrance, a triumphant gleam in their eyes. They had heard nothing from the Duke. They assumed his silence was contemptuous, that he was merely waiting for the most public moment to dismiss the thieving little nobody he had so foolishly championed. They saw his escorting her as the final, cruel prelude to her humiliation. "Look at her," Arabella murmured to Lady Bellamy, her fan fluttering. "Dressed up like a lady. The poor fool has no idea what's coming." Lady Bellamy smiled, a tight, predatory expression.
Pride goeth before a fall. His Grace is merely making an example of her. Phoebe felt the stares, heard the whispers. A year ago they would have terrified her. Now they were merely noise. The Duke's hand rested lightly on her elbow, a point of solid, unwavering support. He had not told her his plan. After their confrontation in the study, he had simply said, "The ball will proceed as planned. You will attend with me. Say nothing of what has passed." His trust in her was implicit, and she returned it in full. They danced the first waltz. Gideon was a surprisingly graceful dancer, his movements as precise and economical as his speech. He held her at a proper distance, yet she was intensely aware of his presence, of the strength in his hand at her back. He said nothing, but his silence was no longer cold. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding that passed between them. As they moved across the floor, the other dancers seemed to melt away, leaving them in a world of their own. When the music ended, the whispers grew louder. Arabella and Lady Bellamy began their campaign in earnest, moving through the crowd, their voices dripping with feigned concern.
Such a shame about Miss Ingram. I hear there have been irregularities at Sorrel Down. The Duke is said to be furious. A breach of trust. The poison spread quickly, quietly. That is how counties turn on their own, quietly, by degrees. Phoebe stood by the Duke's side near the great fireplace, watching the venom take root. She saw erstwhile friendly faces turn cool, saw the pitying glances, the smug satisfaction. Yet she felt no fear. She felt only a strange sense of calm, the stillness at the eye of a storm. At 10 o'clock, when the ball was at its height, the Duke raised a hand. The music trailed into silence, the chatter died away. Every eye in the room turned to him. A nervous hush fell over the assembly. This was it. This was the moment of reckoning. Arabella straightened her shoulders, a perfect picture of concerned beauty. Lady Bellamy held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Thank you for joining me this evening," the Duke began, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the vast room. He was not looking at Phoebe. His eyes were sweeping the crowd, cool and assessing. "I have an announcement to make. It concerns a matter of some gravity, and one that requires clarification before rumor can inflict its damage." He paused. The silence in the room was absolute. "As many of you know," he continued, "I recently engaged Miss Phoebe Ingram to bring order to the affairs of my estate at Sorrel Down." He gestured briefly towards Phoebe, who stood, pale but composed, beside him. "Her work has been exemplary. She has demonstrated a level of diligence, intelligence, and integrity that is exceedingly rare." A confused murmur rippled through the room. This was not the denunciation they had been led to expect. Arabella's smile faltered. "However," the Duke said, and the room went silent again, "it was brought to my attention that a question of dishonesty had arisen. Evidence was presented to me which suggested that Miss Ingram had abused her position." He let the words hang in the air. He saw Lady Bellamy's triumphant expression return. He saw the nods of the gossips. "Evidence is a powerful thing," the Duke said, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. "But it must be true evidence, not a fabrication, not a forgery." Lady Bellamy's face went white. Arabella froze, her fan held halfway to her face. The Duke turned his head slightly. "Mr. Jardine, if you would." From a small antechamber, a man stepped forward. He was of middle age, with a sharp, intelligent face and the sober dress of a solicitor. It was Mr. Simon Jardine, the Duke's man of business from London, a man whose presence here was a shock in itself. He carried a small leather portfolio. Lady Bellamy stared at him, a knot of pure dread tightening in her stomach. She thought he was here about her former debts, to publicly shame her. But Mr. Jardine did not look at Lady Bellamy. He did not look at the Duke. His gaze went directly, respectfully, to Phoebe. He gave a short, formal bow. "Your Grace," he said, his voice clear and precise. The crowd gasped. Arabella dropped her fan. The solicitor had not addressed the Duke of Severn. He had addressed Phoebe Ingram. The solicitor's words echoed in the cavernous silence of the ballroom. "Your Grace." He had spoken them to Phoebe. For a moment, no one understood. The county knew its peerage, and Phoebe Ingram was not a duchess. They assumed the solicitor had made a terrible, embarrassing mistake. Lady Bellamy let out a short, choked laugh of disbelief. "The man is confused," she said, loud enough for those around her to hear. "He means His Grace, the Duke of Severn." Mr. Jardine did not flinch. He continued to look at Phoebe. "If I may have your permission to proceed?" he asked her. Phoebe, as stunned as anyone, could only nod, her mind reeling. "Thank you," the solicitor said. He turned to the assembled guests. "There seems to be some confusion. Allow me to clarify." He opened his portfolio. "I am the executor of the estate of the late Mr. Abel Ingram, Miss Ingram's father. His will was a complex instrument, designed to protect his only child from precisely the sort of avarice and misfortune she might encounter." He glanced pointedly at Lady Bellamy, who looked as though she had been turned to stone. "Mr. Ingram's fortune was placed in a trust," Mr. Jardine continued, "to be managed by his sister-in-law, Lady Honora Bellamy, for his daughter's upkeep. The bulk of the inheritance, however, was to remain sealed until one of two conditions were met: Miss Ingram's 25th birthday, or her marriage to a peer of the realm." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Phoebe would be 25 in 2 months' time. "But the fortune was only part of the inheritance," the solicitor said, his voice rising slightly. "Mr. Ingram's wife, the late Mrs. Mercy Ingram, was the last direct descendant of the 3rd Duke of Pellingham. The title went dormant upon her father's death, as there were no male heirs. However, a special remainder in the letters patent, granted by King George II, allows for the title to pass through the female line in the absence of a male one. Upon the fulfillment of the conditions of her father's will, Miss Phoebe Ingram was not only to inherit a fortune in excess of £80,000, but she was also to petition the Crown to have the dormant title of Duchess of Pellingham called out of abeyance, a petition which, I have on good authority, will be granted without contest." A collective gasp swept the room. £80,000. A duchess in her own right. The girl they had pitied, scorned, and dismissed as a penniless dependent was one of the greatest heiresses in the country, and a peeress of the highest rank. Arabella Vaughan stared, her beautiful face a mask of horror and disbelief. Her entire scheme, her life's ambition, had just crumbled into dust. She had not merely tried to frame a bookkeeper. She had tried to frame a duchess. The scandal would not be Phoebe's. It would be hers. Lady Bellamy made a small, strangled sound. The room began to spin around her. All those years, she had lived on the scraps of a fortune she could have managed honorably, her greed and cruelty blinding her to the truth that had been sitting in a sealed document in her own desk. Her public humiliation was absolute. She swayed on her feet,
and with a low moan, collapsed to the floor in a faint. No one moved to help her. In the stunned silence that followed, Gideon Rothwell, Duke of Severn, finally spoke. He turned to face Phoebe, his expression stripped of all its usual coldness. It was open, serious, and filled with a profound, quiet emotion. "I did not know of the title," he said, his voice low, but carrying in the stillness. He wanted every person in that room to understand. His interest in her had never been about money or rank. "And I did not know of the fortune, but I knew of you." He took a step closer, his eyes holding hers. "I saw a woman of fierce intelligence and quiet strength. I saw a woman who met cruelty with composure and chaos with order. I saw a woman who could restore a forgotten garden and rebuild a broken ledger. I saw integrity. I saw a mind and a spirit that I respected more than any in the world." He went down on one knee. The crowd, which had been in a state of shock, let out another collective gasp, this one of sheer astonishment. The cold, unapproachable Duke of Severn was kneeling on the floor of his ballroom. He did not offer her a title to match his own. He did not speak of uniting their estates. He spoke only to her, of her. "My offer of employment was a pretense," he said plainly. "A test, not of you, but of the world around you. And a way for me to know the woman I had already decided I wished to make my wife. I am asking now, without pretense, Phoebe Ingram, will you be my wife?" Phoebe looked down at him.
At this powerful, silent man, kneeling before her, not as a duke to a duchess, but as a man to a woman, he truly saw. All the years of being invisible, of being diminished and overlooked, fell away. She was seen. She was known. Tears she had refused to shed for years of sorrow now welled in her eyes, not from pain, but from a joy so immense it was breathtaking. She did not offer a grand speech. She gave him the same thing he had always offered her, the plain, unvarnished truth. "Yes," she whispered. The word was small, but in the silent hall it was everything. "Yes." Gideon rose to his feet. He did not kiss her, not yet. He simply took her hand, the one with the ink stains faintly visible on the fingers, and raised it to his lips. It was a gesture of profound fealty, of a devotion openly declared. And as the room finally erupted into a tumult of astonished applause, he looked at her and smiled. It was the first time she had ever seen him do so, and it was like watching the sun rise over a winter landscape. The chaos that erupted after the Duke's proposal was immediate. Lady Bellamy was carried from the room by 2 footmen, her theatrical swoon having turned into a genuine collapse from the shock. Louisa, pale and trembling, rushed after her mother, but not before casting a look back at Phoebe, a look of bewildered, terrified respect. The world she knew had been turned upside down, and the cousin she had pitied was now the most powerful woman in the room. Arabella Vaughan did not faint. Her pride was too strong. With a face as white and rigid as marble, she turned and walked, stiff-backed, out of the ballroom. She did not run. She exited. But everyone present knew they were witnessing the end of her reign. Her social currency, built on beauty and arrogance, had just been rendered worthless. The story of her vicious, failed plot
would be on every lip in the county by morning. It was Lady Theodosia Carmichael, a dowager countess with eyes as sharp as her tongue, who took control of the situation. She had been watching the evening's events unfold with the keen interest of a hawk observing a chess match. She moved to Phoebe's side, her cane tapping decisively on the polished floor. "Well," she declared to the room at large, her voice cutting through the babble, "that's quite enough excitement for one evening. The Duke has made his choice, and a damned sensible one it is. The rest of you, go back to your dancing or your drinking. The spectacle is over." Her authority was absolute. The musicians, taking their cue, hesitantly struck up a new tune. The guests, uncertain but obedient, began to slowly disperse, talking in hushed, excited tones. Lady Theodosia turned to Phoebe, her wizened face crinkling into a wry smile. "Duchess of Pellingham," she said, testing the title. "It has a good, solid ring to it. Though I must confess, I liked you just as well when you were a nobody. You have good sense, a rare commodity." "Thank you, Lady Theodosia," Phoebe said, her voice still shaky. "Don't thank me," the old woman snorted. "Thank your father for his foresight, and thank his grace for having the eyes to see past a plain dress. Now," she said, turning her sharp gaze on the Duke, "Severn, you will take your future wife somewhere quiet. She looks as if she's about to float away. And for God's sake, get the girl a glass of brandy." Gideon, for the first time, looked almost boyishly grateful for the intervention. "Of course," he said. He guided Phoebe away from the thinning crowd, his hand a warm, solid presence at the small of her back. He led her not to a formal receiving room, but through a small, unmarked door and into his private library. The room was the heart of his fortress of solitude. It was vast, lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of books. A fire blazed in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light over the leather spines. The air smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and wood smoke.
It was a room that smelled of permanence and quiet thought. He led her to a deep leather armchair by the fire, and following Lady Theodosia's advice, poured a small amount of brandy into a glass for her. She took it, her hands trembling slightly. "I am sorry," he said, standing before her. She looked up, confused. "Sorry? For what?" "For the theatricality of it all. For making your private history a public spectacle. It was the only way I could see to silence the lies permanently and publicly. To vindicate you in the same arena where they sought to destroy you." "You have nothing to be sorry for," she said, her voice gaining strength. She set the brandy down, untouched. "You gave me a weapon I never knew I had. You gave them justice." He looked at her, at the strength returning to her face, the clear, intelligent light in her eyes. "They saw you as a pawn, Phoebe. They never realized you were the queen." He said her name, Phoebe, and the sound of it in this quiet room, spoken with such reverence, was more intimate than any caress. She thought of the years of being Phoebe dear or poor Phoebe. He said it as if it were a title in itself. "And you, Gideon," she replied, testing his name on her tongue for the first time. "What did you see?" "I saw my future," he said simply. "I have been living in a silent house for a decade, a house full of echoes. When I saw you, I felt possibility, that the silence could be filled not with noise, but with quiet purpose, that the house could become a home. He looked around the library, at the testament to his lonely, ordered life. You bring order, Phoebe, but it is a living order, not a sterile one. He knelt before her again, taking her hands in his. They were no longer trembling. The title, the fortune, they change nothing of what I ask, and they change nothing of who you are. The world will now call you Duchess, but I will always see the woman who understood crop rotation, who painstakingly mended a piece of lace, and who met a false accusation with a quiet ledger of the truth. That is the woman I love. The declaration, spoken so plainly, so sincerely, was the final, beautiful brick clicking into place. The edifice of her new life was complete. She leaned forward, and for the first time, she initiated a touch, placing her hand against his cheek. He was real. This was all real. I believe, she said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face, that we have a great deal of work to do. Together. Together, he repeated, the word a vow. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion or conquest, but about recognition and homecoming. It was a quiet, profound sealing of a pact, a promise of shared days and a shared future, built not on titles or fortunes, but on the solid ground of mutual respect and a love that had found its voice in the plain, simple truth. 1 year later, Kestrel Chase was a house transformed. The silence was still there, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the peaceful quiet of a well-run home, punctuated by the rustle of papers in the library, the distant laughter of staff in the kitchens, and the soft footfalls of a duke and his duchess moving through their shared life. The great house had found its heart. Phoebe, now the Duchess of Severn and Pellingham, had taken to her new role with the same quiet competence she had applied to everything else. She did not preside, she participated. The county, which had been prepared to be intimidated by her new rank, instead found a duchess who would discuss milk yields with them as readily as she would discuss the weather, who inspected the schoolhouse roof herself, and whose management of the vast ducal estates was already becoming legendary. She and Gideon worked as partners, a formidable, united force. He had the authority and the vision. She had the meticulous mind for detail that brought those visions to life. Their desks sat side by side in the great library, often working for hours in companionable silence. Lady Bellamy and Louisa had retreated to a small, damp cottage in a distant county, their only remaining property. The Duke, at Phoebe's quiet request, had settled an annuity upon them, sufficient for a modest life. But their social standing was gone forever. Louisa, stripped of her mother's ambitions, had surprised everyone by marrying a local curate, a kind man who valued her for her gentle nature rather than her name. In her letters to Phoebe, she was, for the first time, genuinely, humbly content. Arabella Vaughan had fled to the continent, her name a cautionary tale whispered by mothers to their ambitious daughters. Mr. Corbett, the squire who had acted as her pawn, found his credit called in by every merchant in the district, and was forced to sell his land, which was promptly bought by the Severn estate and leased back to a more deserving tenant at a fair rate. On a warm summer evening, the anniversary of the ball, Gideon found Phoebe not in the library, but in the newly magnificent glass conservatory she had designed, which was now filled with roses of every shape and color, many of them cultivated from cuttings taken from sorrel down. The air was fragrant with their scent. She was not looking at the flowers. She was looking at a small object she held in her hands. "I wondered where you had gone," he said, his voice soft. He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "I was just thinking," she said, her voice full of quiet wonder, "about how much can change in a year." He followed her gaze to the object in her hands. It was a small, square frame of dark wood and glass. Inside, against a backing of deep blue velvet, was a piece of yellowed cambric, the lace edge exquisitely fine. It was her mother's handkerchief. The rewoven section in the center was so perfect as to be utterly invisible, a seamless restoration. "Mrs. Draycott sent it from Sorrel Down," Phoebe murmured. "She had it framed for me. She said she found it in the pocket of my old gray dress." Mrs. Draycott was now the formidable, devoted housekeeper of Kestrel Chase, her loyalty to Phoebe absolute. Gideon gently took the frame from her and studied the handkerchief. He remembered seeing her working on it at that first assembly, her fingers moving with such focused precision. He had not understood then what he was seeing. He understood now. It was not just a piece of mending. It was a metaphor for her entire life. Taking something broken, something declared worthless, and with patience, skill, and quiet refusal to give up, making it whole and beautiful again. "It was the first thing I truly noticed about you," he said. "The care you took, the precision. I knew, in that moment, that you were a person of substance." He turned her in his arms to face him. "You have restored this house, Phoebe. You have restored these lands. And you have restored me." She smiled, a warm, easy expression that was no longer rare. "We restored each other," she corrected gently. "I was a ledger of figures with no purpose. You gave me a reason to balance the books." He took her hand and brought it to his lips, a gesture that was now as familiar and comforting as breathing. He then reached into his pocket and drew out a small, velvet-lined box. It did not contain jewels. He opened it, and inside, nestled on the velvet, was a single, intricately wrought iron key. She recognized it at once. It was the key to the desk drawer at Bramblehurst, the one she had worn on a chain around her neck for 6 years, the key to the ledgers that had been her secret burden and her only power. "I had it retrieved," he said. "I thought it belonged here. A reminder of the first door you unlocked." Phoebe looked from the key to his face, her heart full. He had not just given her a new life. He had honored her old one. He saw and valued every part of her, the lonely, resilient girl as much as the powerful, beloved Duchess. "It seems," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "that my accounts are finally, perfectly, in order." He drew her close, and in the warm, fragrant air of the conservatory, surrounded by the fruits of their shared labor, he kissed her. It was a kiss of profound peace, of a love that was both a safe harbor and a grand adventure. The quiet, overlooked girl and the cold, silent Duke had found their equilibrium, a perfect balance of purpose and passion, together. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.